to see you all. My name is Cheyenne Boyce. I am the Senior Program Officer here at the Confucius Institute US Center. I see some familiar faces here this evening and also a few people who may be just joining us for the first time here at the center. So of course I would like to say welcome. Thank you for being here and thank you for continuing to support the Confucius Institute programming and events. In honor of Women's History Month, this month our center has explored the roles of women in history, of course, through our recent Women in Confucianism conference. And we have also explored more the stories of Chinese women here in the United States through our recent discussion of the Joy Luck Club at our Books and Boba Book Club meeting recently. So we are very excited about Women's History Month here, and we are very happy to be closing out our March programming with 3 inspiring leaders from our global education community here in DC. Who are going to share some insight on developing careers in global education, as well as their reflections on the unique challenges and benefits of being a woman in leadership in the international job market. So our mission here at the Confucius Institute US Center is to advance cross-cultural understanding through global education. And with DC being a global education hub, we think that it's critical to provide opportunities for young professionals like myself, and I'm sure many of you who are joining us here this evening, with opportunities to hear lessons from the field, as well as advice from those whose footsteps we eventually hope to follow in as we all consider the future of global education and cross-cultural exchanges. So with that being said, I am excited to be joined this evening by first Dr. Joy Hughes, who is the Senior Advisor on East Asia for the Office of the Provost at George Mason University, as well as a board member of the Confucius Institute at George Mason University. We also have Vanessa Bertelli. She is the co-founder and executive director of the DC Language Immersion Project. And we have Sally Schwartz, who is the founder and executive director of Globalize DC. Their bios are included in your program, so I invite you all to look at those more closely. But to go ahead and get started, I would love to just jump into our first question and ask our panelists to just share a little bit more about your current work and how you found yourself in the global education field to begin with. Sure, we would like to start with you, if you like.
All right. Thank you very much, Cheyenne. It is true that I am the senior advisor for East Asia at George Mason, but it's also true that I'm a faculty member in the Bolgeno School of Engineering, which is rather odd. That's my job. My volunteer work, I am on the board of the Confucius Institute, but I am also on the board of the foundation that manages our for-profit technological projects. So I have both hats. So I thought I'd tell you a little bit about how all this happened and why it would be that I would end up doing international things, even though my PhD is in IT and my master's is in computer science. When I was offered my first CIO job, CIO is not Confucius Institute organization, all right? CIO in an organization is the executive who is in charge of all technology. And sometimes more than the technology we think of, the servers and the networks and things like that, but the library, institutional research, the television studio might be part of the CIO's portfolio. And when I was first offered that job, I was, after a few months, quite exasperated because it was clear that some of the people didn't want to be in the group. I was this university's first CIO, and there were faculty who thought this was a really bad idea, particularly putting the library under a technologist. And I felt that the people were deplorable. However, I had to educate myself as to what do you do in a situation like that. So I went to workshops and I read books on organizational development. And actually the theories worked, which surprised me, but they did work. And we ended up with a fantastic IT organization. So then I moved on to a Research One University, Oregon State University. They also asked me to be their first CIO and also brought together the library and other units with IT. And so I had a lot of practice using the organizational development theory there. And then I came to George Mason in 1997 to do it all over again. To bring together these disparate units and convince the people that life was going to be so much more enriching for them if we worked together. Now, one of the things I discovered in this journey was that it was never the people. No matter how irritated you are with the people in your organization, it's not the people. Something in the organization is misaligned. And if you cannot get that into alignment, whether it's the political system, the cultural system, the technical system, you're not going to be successful. So focusing on analyzing the organization, seeing what was out of kilter, and then developing plans to bring that into alignment was how I was able to be successful. So the university decided to start a joint degree program with China. And it ran into some difficulties. So the president, he was my boss, he said to me, well, Joy, you've learned a lot working with these IT organizations. I'd like you to figure out what's wrong with our joint degree program with China and tell us how we can fix it. So I went to China and lo and behold found things like at the universities at that time, their transcripts were all narrative, right? Not course numbers, right? And each semester the faculty would meet and decide how the narrative should change. Whereas back in Fairfax, we had a registrar's office that processed course numbers, IT 102, CHN 203. This is a joint degree. You're supposed to give credit to the other courses, and the other school is supposed to give credit to your courses. And of course, they couldn't do it. So there was a system that needed to be corrected. And so I worked with our registrar and the people in China, and now that is an extremely successful program. And at the national level, it's a program of American Association of State Colleges and Universities, and it is the largest dual degree program between the US and China. So a few months after that, the provost came to see me and said, did you hear we have a Confucius Institute? I said, well, I heard something about it. He said, well, we're having some problems. So we're wondering if you could take some time, because I was still the VP for IT, in your spare time, you could take a look at the Confucius Institute. And so for the last 10 years, I've been partly with the Confucius Institute. I'm on the board now. Again, it was systems that weren't aligned that had to be brought into alignment, and then they were fine. So the time came when I was supposed to retire as a VP and take my seat in the engineering school. So I went on sabbatical first, and that happened to be just about the time the university opened a campus in Korea. And 2 months into the semester, the president of that campus quit. And after having heard his story a long time later, I feel like he had lots of reasons to quit. So I'm not pejorative about him. However, I was on sabbatical, and had done some things with China. So who did they ask to go to Korea and be the president? Promising that it would be for 3 months, because I have a home and a family, right? 3 months plus 12 months later, I came back to Fairfax. But it was a wonderful experience because once again, it was the situation that was out of alignment. The people were trying as hard as they could, which often makes you defensive and nasty when you're really working hard to fix things and you think it's other people's fault. And so we worked together, and I'm happy to say that the campus is flourishing. So that's how I got into international education.
Such an amazing story.
Hi, I got here by a completely different way. I am the co-founder and executive director of DC Immersion. DC Immersion advocates and does engages families and supports educators, does research in order to equitably increase access to multilingual education. And I used to do corporate media law in a London big city firm. So how did I get here? There's no, it's not in any way scripted or linear. And I can, in looking back, there are two things that have led me here. One is Switzerland, and one is having been a stay-at-home mom. Switzerland, I grew up there. I spent my formative years there, and I credit that experience with the unshakable knowledge that multilingualism can be the norm. And it's not only given me faith that through languages we can understand each other better, but it's also been a very, just a proof of the fact that even I, with my privileged background, when competing for jobs with the same privileges I have, won the jobs because of the languages I spoke. So it's not only given me access to opportunity, but it's also allowed me to work in many different countries, one of which is China. And I would like to talk about the experience of having been a stay-at-home mom, because I think it's important to the discussion about being women in leadership. And I used to think about the time when I've been a stay-at-home mom as a gap in my career. And I have substantially revalued that. Being a stay-at-home mom gives you firsthand experience in education. It really allows you to deeply understand how school systems work. You become much more aware about where lack of opportunity begins, inequity of opportunity begins, and it gives you a deep understanding for the hard work of being a teacher. When you have 3 kids, you value those who can wrangle 20. So yeah, this is how I came to working in international education.
Hello. It's interesting listening to these stories, so I guess this is mine. I'm a third-generation Washingtonian. I don't know how many of you in the room were born in Washington. Anybody? Yay. There still are some here. There's still some here. Maybe not for long.
Yeah.
Fourth, third generation. Nice meeting you. But I think probably once I hit high school, junior high, high school, and I went to public school here in the city. I don't know, what makes you interested in international global affairs? That was always something that really fascinated me. But growing up in the city, we lived with the fact that Washington was two cities. And one city was, well, I mean, it was a little bit different time, but one city was international, the federal presence, the official Washington, and then there's the local Washington. And I went to a really special program, and since we're sort of reminiscing, when I was in ninth grade, I had the opportunity as a DC public school student to go to a summer program. I learned Swahili. We engaged with ambassadors. It was sponsored by St. Albans. It was free to DC public school students. And I think ever since then, if not before, this idea that we're living in the city and yet we have such little connection with the global parts of the city, and we take such little advantage of that. The connections are so poor, and remain so today. So this has really driven a lot of my thinking. I've stayed in Washington, even though, I mean, I've gone away for a little bit, but really I've made Washington my home. And I would say that my career in global education, which started before there really was a field in global education. We might talk about that later. But, you know, it was just sort of wealthy people going on trips abroad. It was not a field. This idea that regular kids growing up in the city, mostly disadvantaged students, they need to have access to the world and languages and feel connected and empowered by that. So I have been a high school teacher. I have been a public school administrator in DC public schools doing international programs in the central office. Now I'm working as a nonprofit administrator. I think I'm a very situational person. I am still dealing with the same challenges that I did when I was very young. Globalize DC, which is an organization that I founded after I left DC public schools, really looks at how we can give access to our public school students to global education, study abroad, and language learning. And we do this very largely by trying to bridge the gap between the assets in our city and the local kids. I would say our work now really focuses on the challenges around access, equity, and something that we're really working on now is how do we move beyond the one-off opportunity, the 6 weeks in China, and really create a pipeline to college and careers. So anyway, that's the beginning of my story.
Absolutely. You all, hello testing. You all have such inspiring stories. Thank you so much for sharing. And Sally, I'm so glad that you sort of led us into thinking about the newness of the field of global education and international education. And of course, that's something we want to explore a little more deeply through this conversation tonight. So as we look at the current landscape of the field and we think about challenges and barriers to involvement, we know that access to like learning about different languages and cultures at an early age really does have an impact. I know for me, I had my first opportunity to go abroad to Japan when I was a high school student. Completely blew my mind. Can't imagine what would have happened if I had had that opportunity even earlier in my life. But thinking about the current field, we know that there's huge gaps in our language learning here in the United States, especially. The American Council on Teaching of Foreign Languages has actually reported that in the United States, at the K through 12 level, approximately 20% of students are enrolled in language courses, and that actually drops to about 8.1% at the post-secondary level. So how do you all see these statistics play out in your daily work? Vanessa, perhaps you can share sort of from the early ages of life through immersion programs, and Sally, perhaps at the secondary level, you can add on as well.
Sure. So we're in DC in the part that is supposed to be international and have all of these connections. And yet, try and guess how many kids in DC are in multilingual education at an elementary level. What percentage? 5%. You're very close. It's 8. 8% of DC kids, the nation's capital, are on a path to becoming multilingual and multi-literate. And that is a travesty, because not only we're not capitalizing on the emerging bilinguals that enter the school system as English language learners, but also we're not allowing those whose minds are blown to go further and do these, have these travel abroad experiences with the language that would allow them to reap even more benefits from them.
So I think compared to other states, when you look at high school graduation requirements, DC actually is sort of on the progressive side. It requires 2 years of it requires 2 years of the same language to graduate, taken at the high school level. I mean, there are states that don't require world languages. So I guess in that sense, we're okay. But if you look at across the city, and again, I'm just so narrowly focused on DC. I apologize. I don't look nationally. I just look at what we have here, because it is such a disgrace to be in this city and not have the best global education or language programs. So at the secondary level, when kids are taking their required courses for graduation, and some may have come up through immersion programs, but most have not. This city is primarily a city that offers Spanish and some French, a sprinkling of Chinese, a couple Arabic, a couple Italian, not much else. So where there's a demand for critical languages, there's so many languages that are not taught. Japanese is a language where there's a high demand, and it's not taught anywhere in the city. Russian, Korean, I mean, any language other than Spanish and French, it's really hard to find. And the secondary schools that you find that offer languages, not just the less commonly taught languages, but the higher level languages, are going to be on the western, more affluent parts of the city. So you have students who, I remember a young man who has become famous. He went to George Mason. He was on a State Department study abroad program, NSLY. I don't know if you've heard of National Security Language Initiative for Youth. Had a 6-week free trip when he was a 10th grader. And when we interviewed him for this trip, on his transcript, it said he had taken Spanish 1 and 2, and then he wasn't taking any more Spanish at his high school. And I remember to this day, this was 2009, I asked him, why have you not continued with your Spanish? Here was a kid who wanted to start studying Chinese. And he said, oh, we're not allowed to take Spanish 3 at my school. I was like, that seems very unusual. Well, it turned out they didn't offer Spanish 3 at his school. So, so most of our students at the secondary level don't have access, can take the minimum, the bare minimum.
And if I may say that, it's exactly what we see at the elementary level, but throughout the dual language offerings. DC Immersion was instrumental in the opening of the first 2 dual language programs east of the river. And for those of you who are not familiar with DC, that is the part of the district that has the highest degree of poverty and a very large number of families. And so there were no multilingual education programs east of the river. And still, even with the 2 that we helped support and open, we're nowhere near being in any being near equity at all. So it's not only that it's only 8% of the kids in the district that have these opportunities, is that these opportunities are offered in a very inequitable way.
Absolutely. And as we continue to think about the numbers are low, and we know that as well as numbers being low, women are underrepresented in many fields, not just global education. But at the same time, we also see the number, when it comes to the numbers of students studying abroad, often many women are taking advantage of more global education opportunities. And Joy, it's wonderful to have you a part of this conversation as well, because you add another layer of global education and STEM. And we know that there's a number of programs and things that are helping to get more women involved in STEM. So maybe you could just share a little bit about the connections between STEM and global education from your perspective.
First, I'd like to say that I graduated from high school in 1954, which was a very long time ago, and we were required to take 2 years of language. And the world has really changed since then. And the necessity for people to know and understand and speak the language of others has grown exponentially, and still it's 2 years of language, which if you meet anyone my age who had 2 years of language, they'll tell you how little they learned. I mean, it's just not enough to go to class. You have to be immersed in it. And I'll give a plug for the Confucius Institutes. For those of you who don't know the Confucius Institute, one of the things that we do are the Confucius classrooms, which help school districts with funding to teach Chinese and provide materials. Another thing we do is sponsor free trips to China, educational trips where the students do work in advance to understand the culture, and then they go to China to actually see it in action. So bad news and some good news, right? But in STEM, one of the things we learned is you have to understand the problem before you can address it. When we first started out in trying to attract women into STEM fields, we thought that holding workshops and conferences and things like that for them would be the answer. Teach them how to code, all right. But it wasn't the answer. So one day a friend of mine who is now, she's the vice president for IT at Jacobs Engineering now, but she asked me to go with her to Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology, which is supposed to be the best high school in the United States. And we had a big room filled with female students. And one of the things that they told us was that they were not going to study technology or science in college. So we were stunned. We said, well, what are you here for? I mean, this is a hard school to get into and to stay in. And they said, well, our parents said it's the best school in Virginia and probably in the country, so we better go here. Well, why wouldn't you major in science or technology? And they said, well, first of all, that's for nerds. That's not for people who like people, who want to work with people. And think of all the problems in the world today. We want to work to solve those problems. So again, Cora and I were sitting there with our mouths open because, like, how can you solve problems without science and technology, we're thinking, right? But and anyway, in any event, they told us what their perceptions of the field were. All right. Now, at George Mason in Korea, we have a global affairs major. It has 1/10 of the enrollment of the economics major and the business major. And if you ask the people in why they don't major in global affairs, they'll tell you, well, nobody gets a job in that field, right? So there are two sides of the same coin. People have perceptions that influence whether they'll choose to take Spanish 3 if it's offered. One big perception is, what good is it? Who else is doing it? Are they my kind of people? Are they nerds, or are they social beings, So in the STEM area, what we had to do was to change the perceptions. And we started a program called Technology Goddesses with T-shirts of the goddesses and backpacks. And we partnered with the Girl Scouts because they had more clout than we did, and convinced them to offer technology badges that the girls could earn doing fun things, such as creating a website for a food bank. And so we tried to marry the projects to changing the world. And that has made a huge difference. And the early, I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds of students in this now, but the early people went on to college and majored in technology. But their mind is set on helping the world. So I think part of the global education as either a major or as an immersive language experience has to be that the person is saying, why? They're asking themselves the question, why? Sometimes it's that the school doesn't offer it. Often the school doesn't offer it. But sometimes the student's saying, why me? Why should I do this? And that's where I think the notion of involving this in lots of fun, which we try to do in the Confucius Institute, lots of this paper cutting and calligraphy and Tai Chi, lots of fun and many, many role models that are not us, role models that are 18, 20, 22, a role model like you can make a difference.
Absolutely. That actually affected me pretty strongly. Thank you. And of course, making the why very clear is important for all of us here working in this field. And so would sort of like to touch on, of course, some of the other challenges that may arise, especially for Sally and Vanessa, but how have you remained steadfast in your work despite these challenges? It could be from the perspective of a woman in the field or just the challenges that come from the work, the policy, the funding, the many, many things that impact our ability to do the work. How have you remained encouraged?
So,
I want to hear what you say.
So it starts off with encouragement, right? You don't even get to anywhere where you need encouragement without encouragement to begin with. And I've been very lucky in that Sally was one of my first encouragers. She could have sat back and just figured something else, but she decided that she wasn't going to. She was just, however difficult it was going to be to get an entire school system to buy in to the need for more international experiences, she didn't care. She was just going to do it. And that is something that has given me the faith in, if it needs to be done and it has some resemblance of maybe being possible, then we should try it. And so Sally, Marty Abbott at ACTFL have been key, together with a number of other women, have been key in getting me started. But where it really, your question about how many women are in this field and how many women we're conducting a study on the demographics of dual language programs with the University of Maryland. And we're actually looking at it from a racial perspective, and I haven't thought about looking at it from a gender perspective, but I will go into it and I will have a look to see if by any chance girls are under or overrepresented in these programs. But what I do know is that in dual language programs, we do not have a why issue. The demand for multilingual education is off the charts. Parents, because in early childhood education and up until 12th grade, you're sort of going along with what your parents tell you to. That is, the why is perfectly clear. It's perfectly clear to parents that children with linguistic abilities are going to be better off than their peers. Or at least it's clear to many parents. It's not access to this information is also unequitably distributed across the district. But we don't have an issue of people understanding why. We do have an issue with funding, just to mention one. Joy, if you could do the same work that you did with STEM, with the multilingual education in terms of getting the big funders behind it, I would be most appreciative. Because that is one of the big issues. There isn't the same muscle that there is behind STEM to support the growth of multilingual education. And so that is a key challenge that we see.
So to your question about like how you sort of push through, when I was a teacher, back in the 70s, that's when I started teaching. And I didn't stay in the classroom for that long, maybe 6 years. I honestly felt, if you think back on, if you read your history books about what the 70s was like, teaching was a woman's profession. And I loved it, but I also felt uncomfortable, like this is my life choice. I'm gonna be a teacher or a nurse. Something seemed wrong with that. And when that was sort of a weak response, right? I should have gone for it. But I knew I had to stick with it, but I couldn't really stay in the classroom. And as I have moved on in my career, I understand better why it was more than just the fact that it was sort of identified as a woman's profession that I needed to push out. I just think that maybe it's in me. There's a joke about banging your head against the wall, and it feels so good when it's over. Some people may know that joke. It is not easy work. I mean, I know Vanessa knows this, and we tell our war stories. It takes a really long time, and I feel like some people say, oh, there's been so much success. I don't really feel that way. We have so far to go. And as you mentioned, there's so many people that grew up here in the 50s, and they talk about, in our schools, we had all these language programs, and they're not there anymore in this day and age. So there's just something in me, I think, that I have not flitted around from issue to issue. I have not gone after a job, I don't think, in my life. It's always been determined by how best can I solve this problem. So that's why this is just me. I had a mentor once who told me that, you have to wait for the right time. You just sort of have to I was a student at the time, and he just said, history is long. The arc of it takes a long time, and sometimes things align and things happen. So I guess that's part of what keeps me going, is that you just have to keep pushing. Nothing is easy. That's a terrible answer, but this is very depressing.
There's also, if I may add, there's also something that is really, I think, comes from, as women, and I don't mean to generalize, but we often care too much, and we often want to go in and fix problems where we see them acutely, and we just lose perspective of the sustainability of the venture over a long period of time. We just feel the urge to go in and help. And so we might concentrate, like this is a real issue that DC Immersion has faced. We were so intent in reaching out to communities over here who needed to know about this, or who needed support on engaging their elected official over there, or that wanted to start this and that program, and so how could we support them, that we lost, that we didn't focus on. It's like when you're on an airplane and they say, in case of loss of pressure, put your own oxygen mask on and then tend to the children around you. We don't do that. And that is actually a real issue, and it is a challenge, and it undermines the success of it undermines the ultimate goals that we're after. And so if DC Immersion had concentrated even only like a tenth of its energies in looking for funding, we would have been even more effective and even more influential in operating change than we have.
No, absolutely. And I think you all shared wonderful advice, of course. And Vanessa, to your point, for sure, I think for me as a young professional who's also a millennial, very mission driven, it is difficult sometimes to imagine what the sustainability sort of looks like and how to make the decisions now that are going to best impact us long term, when I sometimes can't even imagine the long term. So I appreciate that for sure. And I'd like to sort of stay in this area of advice and sort of ask, where would you all like to see us go? The young professionals in the field, the people who are hoping to continue to be leaders and change agents like you are. What challenges do we specifically need to address, and where would you like to see us go next?
I would like to jump in with one thought. Everyone in this room, I don't know if global education is your field, but I know you'll be very successful. My suggestion is to reach back for those that come behind you, in particular those who are left behind in the global education arena. We have a problem in our heads about who global education is for, still to this day. And I cannot tell you how many times in trying to have these discussions about how important it is for students to learn about the world. This was before the language around global competencies, but it was they need to be able to engage with others, to have cross-cultural communication, to speak other languages, to experience what it's like to go abroad. I would sit and talk to people in powerful positions, in a position to make change. And they would sit and listen to me, and when I finished, they would say, I want you to understand, I get everything that you're saying. I used to work at the Department of State doing exchange programs, or my children are in a bilingual program. But for the students we work with, we have other things we need to do, like teach them to read. Or as someone said to me, they don't know how to get downtown on the metro, so why should they be going to China? You know, my response is, after they go to China, they will know how to get downtown on the metro. But this is still there. It's a real, and it's also, it's also in the head of the people we're talking about serving, that this is not for us. So I think this problem, we haven't really moved very far in this area, and I think what's in your head is so important. So I would say to all those people who are moving on, think about having an expansive view of global education and really making it a part of your mission to reach back to those who get left behind in these programs. It really shouldn't be, I think study abroad is still like a white middle-class woman thing. And I think we need to be more expansive, and I know you can help with that.
In thinking about your own career, if you're feeling a little stuck or you're wondering about the next step, I truly believe if you're expecting to have a leadership position in 10 years, you have to be a leader now. Whatever job it is that you were hired for, make yourself into a leader in that job. Look around you and see, I'm for looking for problems that can be solved, right? Analyzing them. deeply listening to people, listening for understanding, so that you understand the structure of your own organization and the interests of the people in it. And then if you have partner organizations that you're working with, you need to understand them and their interests too, so that you can come up with, as these ladies did in their jobs, come up with possible solutions and sell them to other people. I know that Sally said she never applied for a job, but she sold lots of ideas to people. Right? You've sold lots of ideas to people. So learn what Cheyenne means about sustainability and what Vanessa said about sustainability, so that you're not discouraging yourself by continually proposing things for the organization to do that have no opportunity for sustainability. So that's what I would advise you. Be a leader now.
To add, and we will take questions after this, so if you have a question, my colleague Kayla will come and pass the microphone as well, so you can think about that. But
So I would add that, yes, to all of that, I would add two things. That your path is unique. And as women, we're still inventing what is possible, particularly in this field of international education, that we're making it. It doesn't exist in the fully fleshed out way that it needs to. And so we're inventing the building blocks of it and the vision for it. And so don't fit in, just go for what you think is in a sustainable way. Always, always. Do not even get started if you don't have who's gonna back you. And if you're afraid to ask, you just need to get over it, because you need to ask first for advice, for money, for whatever it is that you need, so that you can go and address this issue and build this other block in this building of the field. And the other thing that I would recommend is come work for DC Immersion. Absolutely. Wonderful. No, I am personally inspired by all of the advice that you shared, for sure. I know that it seems so, it resonates so closely with me right now in the space that I'm in, and especially in my work here at the Confucius Institute, so I appreciate that. Do we have any questions from the audience? If you have a question, I believe Kayla will come and meet you with the microphone.
Hi. Okay. Hi, my name is Alessandra, and I'm a monitoring and evaluation officer for the Institute of International Education. And I work on a number of different cross-cultural education programs. But sir, I want to thank you first for your panel. There's a lot that resonated with me. Being a global educator in a family where there's also a teacher for domestic schools, there is a lot of that conversation about what education should come first or things like that. But my question sort of expands on what Sally was saying about expanding the view of global education, and draws on my monitoring and evaluation background with asking if you were to conduct a needs assessment here in DC for non-formal education opportunities for DC students, for DC people, what would you want to include in that needs assessment? And the reason why I'm asking is because I think that greater community buy-in through non-formal education, like using Joy's example from earlier, engaging with the Girl Scouts to increase STEM education for girls, is one of the greatest challenges to legitimizing global education that DC or other communities face.
So I'm going to, I can't see you, but let me sort of give you my answer on this. And I want to push back a little not push back, but I want to offer something else besides non-formal education. Something that I have gotten into, and this is one of the things I'm really excited about, is thinking about education beyond the four walls of the school in a form not so much non-formal or non-recognized, but as part of schooling. So if I can elaborate, for 6 years, we sent students to Japan through an exchange program that we were invited to participate in. As I said before, there's no Japanese taught in the schools. And every summer, students would come back from Japan eager to learn Japanese. And there's no Japanese offers, so it would be like a dead end. And these are families that could not afford to put them in a private class. So we created an after-school Japanese language program that exceeds the seat hours and the standards. It's aligned to ACTFL. We created an after-school program to offer Japanese. This is our 3rd year. Our students are doing fantastically. They're scoring really high. We came in 7th in the National Japan Bowl, so I'm really proud. And we have been working with, however you want to put it, the DC officials to recognize with credit this language program. And I feel for the field of global education and languages especially, there will never be equity in our schools in the city, never. And there will never be access to critical languages unless we break down those walls. And I would just say that a club or an informal way to do language is not enough, that we really need to think about how any student in this city who wants to take Russian or Korean with an idea that that's going to advance his or her career should be able to do it and have it count for credit so that they can continue along a pathway. So this is sort of a new area that I'm in, and I would love to talk to you about it some more, because I do think working with the community, with our global assets, and working outside the school, the four walls of the school, and really being able to take advantage of the resources that are here is one way to kind of break down these divisions in the city and open access.
And I wanted to add a couple of initiatives that DC Immersion is working on. And first of all, I just wanted to, when we talk about how communities evolve, this is very much a community discourse. Entire communities have been essentially left out of the conversation about not only multilingual education, but in general international education. And so what we see is that through things like dual language programs in schools, we see an effect on intergenerational learning, in that the 3-year-old comes home to his or her parents and or caregivers, and the caregivers are all of a sudden confronted with a language that they do not know anything about, but are intrigued and do see the value in terms of getting the job in hospitality that they might be looking for, and so the learning happens in the home throughout the community in a way that extends far beyond the walls of the school. But in order to, and then going back to these two initiatives that DC Immersion is working on, to capitalize on all that DC has to offer that you're not necessarily aware of if you're not on the mailing list of the Confucius Institute, or if you're not on, if you don't look at certain publications, and so we've been working on a DC Global Calendar that aggregates all of the free or low-cost events that are going on all the time in our city in a variety of languages, and that look at a variety of cultures that are just there and not leveraged for all that they can. And we also created a go-to guide of all things multilingual, which is associated with the Multilingual Education Fair that we created and that is now will be in its 4th year, where we invite those who provide resources to learn languages in a variety of different settings to come and put those resources at the fingertips of the very diverse communities that we managed to engage with and call to this event. So there are a variety of ways that we can do this. We just need to find the backers and the funding to make this possible, and give agency back to families and to communities in a way that goes even beyond the offering of something in a school.
Thanks. I'm Madeline from down the road at CIUS. And the last 2 questions made me think, you talked a lot about the discrepancy between the resources, the international city and the DC schools. To what extent are, for instance, embassies engaged in this endeavor to bring more global education? And when you talked about the global calendar, obviously embassies have a lot of activities. They even do open houses, but do they get involved, and do any of the other international and multilateral institutions here see part of their role as helping in these efforts?
Even if they don't see that role, their funders are operating on a matrix of number of people engaged and number of people attending their events. So to a certain extent, their bottom line is the same as our bottom line in terms of getting people to those, for the most part, wonderful offerings. So I think that there is an alignment that goes beyond the depth of the understanding of what the need is or the inequity. And so they are absolutely partners and can be even more than they currently are.
So when I worked in DC Public Schools, we had an office called the Office of International Programs, and that was the biggest part of my job, was engaging with partners outside. People who would come to us with opportunities for the most part, rather than me reaching out. So embassies, particularly the larger ones, do a lot for the city. Our Chinese program in DC Public Schools started through a relationship with the Embassy of China. The Embassy of France did a lot to bring French into the schools. There are a lot of resources, and there's an embassy adoption program that has been around for 45 years, something like that, that is just an amazing program with many, many scores of embassies involved, and it's been replicated around the world. So embassies do a lot. The problem is that, again, I hate to always harp on inequities, but it takes a lot of work for someone, when someone comes to you and says, I want to work with you in order to do a program in schools. There aren't people there to do that. Now, some schools that have a lot of family engagement, again, in certain parts of the city, have people who can really work with the outside partners and take advantage. But when you are talking about a school that is a high poverty school that is underfunded, it is really hard for those schools to take advantage of free things. Not to mention that they're often geographically most distant from where the resources are. So there are so many built-in inequities that make it hard, and we need to figure out how to help those people. But I think I would just say embassies have more to offer than we are taking advantage of.
But also a key element here, as Sally was mentioning, is when I draw up a budget for the DC Global Calendar, the relationships with the embassies and with the Smithsonian and establishing those and building up the technical part of the calendar is a minute part of the budget of the DC Global Calendar, because the larger part of the expense is actually the outreach to make sure that this tool is fully at the fingertips of every family in the district, and the education around why this is important and why you can absolutely use your free Metro card that all of your students have in order to go there, and how you can reach out to the Smithsonian to have this program done in the language that you need for the age group that you need. Like the biggest expense from a programmatic perspective is the outreach, is the community engagement.
Yes, I have a question for the panel and for the audience, because I'm struck by how there seems to be a group of people who feel very passionately about the importance of engaging globally, international partnerships, international skills, but that isn't translated to whole school districts requiring immersion programs or things of that nature. And the needs assessment comes into this too, because if you do a needs assessment and the parents say, yes, it would really be good if my children had the opportunity to be in an immersive program, my guess is that goes nowhere in the budget, right? However, when companies say, we're not hiring people at decent jobs without technology skills, suddenly you have a national movement called STEM. It wasn't because parents said, I really think it would be great if you could program. No, it was companies saying, this is what we want in our employees. And as Vanessa said, in some neighborhoods where the people are very poor and they're hoping their son or daughter will get a job when they graduate, they know that if you can speak Spanish, for example, your chances of getting a job in as a waiter or as a cook are increased. So they've made their own little STEM, right, quasi-STEM. I don't know how a needs assessment of parents would influence the budget. It seems as if the audience that has to speak out are the companies. So we would rather, we'll take you over you because you can speak 3 languages.
So you're absolutely right, Joy. There is, like, you're spot on, you're dead on the money. So what DC Immersion figured out very early on is that there needed to be all of the states that have most aggressively pursued multilingual education have started from economic rationale, not an education rationale, not, oh, our children will read better in 5th grade in English, or it started because a state is landlocked and their national resources are running out, and they need to figure out how their workforce is going to be desirable in 20 years' time. And that's what has driven Utah, that's what's driving California, was Kentucky, Georgia. DC cannot sit back and see this play out. And so one of the first one-pagers that we built at DC Immersion was, what does the district gain with languages? And we looked at all of the economic points of pressure that are alleviated through more multilingual education. At the back of my business cards, I have the finding from University of Cardiff that the opportunity cost of the UK having a monolingual workforce, a predominantly monolingual workforce, is £50 billion a year. And so how much is the district missing out on? And then with New American Economy, the think tank that produced the Not Lost in Translation report, we worked with them to do a DC region specific sub-report of that to show exactly how the demand for multilinguals had increased, and who are the companies across all sectors, not only hospitality and the ones that we would imagine, but across every single business sector. And with those arguments, we have been able to get to budgets in the way that when we started this work 5 years ago, none of our 13 council members had the faintest clue what a dual language program is. And 5 years later, 9 of them co-introduced a bill to accelerate the expansion of dual language programs. So it is exactly that. It is exactly the pull from it's the economic rationale.
Absolutely. I'm so glad that our conversation, thank you for the question, sort of went in this direction, because I think it leaves us with a lot to consider as we continue to move forward. And of course, we appreciate the advice and the insight that you've been able to provide for us this evening. So with that, please join me in giving our panelists a hand. Thank you so much for being here. I think we may have had a few questions. Perhaps if you're able to stick around, I'm sure they would love to get to know you all a little bit more. And on behalf of the Confucius Institute US Center, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Shameless plug, if you have not learned about our Books and Boba Book Club, please consider joining us. It's a very informal, relaxed book club focused on things related to Chinese culture. And Kayla is happy to give you more information about it. Thank you all so much. Please enjoy the rest of your evening, and we hope to see you again soon.